Erica, thank you so much for joining us at the Israel Daily News. I'm very much looking forward to speaking to you about something that has been on my heart, which is the trauma of myself as a journalist covering this war and of the world. I think the world is hurting right now. So thank you for joining us and bringing us your psychoanalytical expertise.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's very exciting that you're here in Israel and that on your 5 day trip, you've decided to spend some time to talk with us about your research and about your findings and your meetings. So let's start with a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you were able to segue into talking about the issues that you care about here in Israel.
Well, I'm a psychoanalyst, also a social worker. I was a social worker before I was a psychoanalyst, and an author, and I write parenting books. And I basically write books about the rise in the mental health crisis in children and adolescents around the world. And so my first book was about the importance of attachment security for future mental health, and my second book was about building resilience in adolescence for future mental health.
I think that that's going to really play a role in our interview today. Unfortunately, after October 7th, I think that there has been so many people at every age group that have experienced trauma. And specifically last night, we had the bodies of four adults returned to us who had been held hostage in Gaza. And one of them had a daughter who was murdered in front of the family. And the other daughter I saw a clip of her on the morning news, probably 6 a.m. This young woman was awake, and she's in her adolescence years. And she spoke on the news, and I couldn't help but think to myself, she's a preteen. She probably shouldn't have had to go through this trauma, and what is her life going to look like moving forward? So can you speak to us about the trauma in the different age groups and what we can do to support young people today throughout Israel?
Well, I mean, generally, children have very good defenses, even better than adults. So that means that they can handle quite a bit. But the extent to which they're being forced to face, realities is and adversities here overwhelms their senses. So, I think there's a common belief that if you don't talk about things that are traumatic, it's better. And in Israel, I know there's this sort of ethos of, we don't talk about it, we just keep moving. We keep working, we keep, we move on. The problem is that with children and adults, that grief has to have its time. It doesn't always have its time immediately, but the idea is that helping children to cope with what they're experiencing means allowing them to express sad feelings and angry feelings and frightened feelings, and for the adults too. So it's sort of counter to the Israeli sort of philosophy of, we move on, and I understand that, but really human beings do need to process all of their feelings. Otherwise, there are consequences, maybe not immediately, but usually later on.
So I think that's very interesting, and I just want to get vulnerable for a moment because we're going here and say that personally, I have been feeling such a deep sense of sadness in the last few weeks specifically, and I think it's come in waves. I think for me as a journalist, the first few months after October 7th was just go time, and it was just time to get work done and get work out. And it wasn't until I came away and actually left the country that I was able to realize that what I had experienced just as a civilian, and actually I shouldn't say just as a civilian, because I was pouring through the stories and meeting with people and taking interviews with people who had had firsthand loss. And I think that we don't, as people, give ourselves a break because first of all, there's a lot of stimulation that we need to attend to. So you might need to answer 10 messages in your inbox. You might need to read 10 articles to stay up to date. You might need to get your kids to school and do your work and clean your home. And I think that there's just a lot going on for even the average person, right? So I think it's important that there is time for healing. What would you say are some important ways for people to heal and for people to share?
Well, modern society doesn't give you space, is what you're saying, that there's no space. You need space to mourn and you need space to process. And so that means, not filling your time with busyness and allowing yourself to be bored and allowing yourself to be with the people that you love without busyness. And in those moments, there are very vulnerable moments for human beings, and usually it's when they go to sleep and when they wake up. Those are their most vulnerable moments. And you'll find that, I don't know what the rates are in Israel right now, but I would guess that there's a lot of sleep issues in Israel, because that's when you, at the end of the day, when it's quiet, that's when you process, what you haven't been processing all day. And it's also when children process what they don't get to process during the day. They process it when they're going to sleep and when they wake up. And one of the things I've been telling people while I'm here is, as someone who emphasizes attachment security, is sleep with your children again.
Really?
Just get the biggest bed you can get and just everybody jump in bed and sleep together. Like in a big pile, like they did in caveman days. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of evidence to show that nighttime security is even more important than daytime security for people's mental health in terms of feeling emotionally safe and secure. And so it's like it's like an old iPhone, charging your battery. Sometimes in the old iPhones would take 9 hours. So think of it as charging your battery at night. So during the day, you can withstand whatever you have to withstand. And I think actually both COVID and October 7th were probably hardest here, as I'm collecting information and I'm here, on single people who were not sleeping with a lot of other people, meaning their spouses or their children or their dogs. But there is something to be said about mitigating the effects of all this trauma by a lot of physical skin-to-skin contact with the people you love. And if you're single, you grab your friends and you hug them, and you hug them, and you hug them as much as you possibly can. There's something called oxytocin, which is a love hormone, and it is inversely connected to cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So the more oxytocin we produce in our brains, the more we can combat stress and adversity. And so that means more skin-to-skin contact. It means more contact. It means more relational contact. It means more nurturing. It means more being nurtured. And that gives you more resilience to deal with adversity and cortisol.
It's so interesting that you mention this, because I had a very successful article, and I say that it's successful because of the feedback that I got from people and the number of responses that I got. And I've actually found through a lot of my work that it's the work about people-to-people relations that get people talking, or that even get the so many views on the article. And one thing that I wrote was that I have a rowing partner. Now, I'm not married, and I go rowing once a week on Fridays, and I have had the same rowing partner for 5 years. She's also a single woman. And every Friday since October 7th, before we would get in the boat, we would have a very long hug. And I wrote about that in the article, about how necessary it was. I didn't have a boyfriend for most of the time. I wasn't dating anyone that I could have such a long hug with. And she and I talked about how when we didn't meet on Fridays for the hug, how much harder the week was.
Yeah.
And so I'm really happy to hear you say that. And it brought me to tears when you said about getting everyone in the bed together, just because I think people were taken out of their homes on October 7th. People were ripped out of their beds on October 7th. And I think that's what was so emotionally triggering for me when you said one way to combat the trauma is to get everybody together in the bed. And I think that I think what touched many families, especially young families in Israel, is that people were taken out of their homes in their pajamas. They weren't ready. And there's no time to ever be ready to be abducted. But I think that being abducted with your pajamas on and you're being pulled and yanked out of your bed is probably an even higher level of trauma.
Yeah.
And it's something I think about when I get into my bed, how grateful I am to have my bed, how grateful I am to assume that I'm going to wake up in my bed in the morning. And I've had that on my mind a lot. So I'm really glad that you talked about that. I want to move into a very relevant topic. Unfortunately, the state of Israel buried Shiri Bibas and her two little tiny children yesterday. And that was a nationwide trauma, if not a global trauma. And a lot of that is because of the image of her being taken into captivity, holding on to her two young kids.
Wrapping the blanket around her children. I remember that image, yeah.
And there's two components that I'd like you to speak on here. One is the image and the images that have impacted society. Why is it that the hostages that were taken captive, that there were video of, and that the families promoted video and imagery of, why was there more emphasis on getting those hostages home? Because everyone saw their faces psychologically. And how do you recommend that a community heal from the trauma of seeing them go out and seeing them come back in coffins? How do you can you just respond to the news?
Well, I mean, the Bibas tragedy, I think that represents the grief of the entire Jewish people. I mean, not just in Israel, just the image of a mother and the most vulnerable young children and a mother, the most vulnerable being taken and brutally murdered. So that, I think that impacts me also at a very deep level. In terms of healing the trauma, again, I don't think there isn't one way to heal from trauma, but the general wisdom is that you don't, what we say is repression is a wonderful emotion if it lasted a lifetime, but the problem is it doesn't, and it ends up popping up at very inconvenient moments in life. And so, the idea of encouraging people in the right moment, in the quiet moments, first to have quiet moments, and then, to check in with the people that you love and ask them how they're doing. And ask them how they're feeling. And on any given day, you might be feeling something different. There's no expectation of, what you don't want is for them to feel that they have to suppress and repress the feelings. And so, checking in on a more regular basis and allowing for a variety of feelings, from I'm fine today to I'm not fine today, and I'm feeling depressed today, or I'm feeling angry today, or I'm feeling sad today, or I'm feeling scared today, and not judging those feelings, but just allowing them to be, and being a very good listener as a friend and a family member. And so I think and trauma takes, it doesn't take days, and it doesn't take weeks, and it doesn't take months. It takes years to process trauma. And so it means really, staying attuned to the feelings of the people that you care about.
So I want to move into some of the work that you do that is very relevant to the book that you published about being around for your kids, specifically as a mother, between the ages of 1 and 3 years old. And my mother is actually an early childhood education professional, and so I know how important early childhood education is. But in this country, two parents need to work for the most part in order to be able to provide for the family. And it's also a 9-hour workday here, which I want to bring into consciousness, because when I came to Israel as an American, I had already thought that the 8-hour workday was too long. Personally, I actually, when I was faced with reality, I said to my dad, how is it possible that I'm supposed to be going to an office for 8 hours a day for the rest of my life? I don't get it. This was maybe week one of me, or month one of me on a traditional, however traditional a TV news job could be, but traditional job. And he said, that's life. That's what it is. And then I came to Israel, and life was actually 9 hours. of work. Mind you, in Israel, there is more of a culture of taking a break for a coffee or having a full 1 hour lunch, whereas in the United States, sometimes that's frowned upon. So there are pros and cons to the workplace. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because in a previous conversation with you, you mentioned to me that one of the best ways to prevent difficulty through trauma is by having a strong foundation from years 1 to 3, and that's why that's relevant to this conversation for the Israel Daily News, because we cover the news and we cover what's happening. Can you speak to us about the importance of safeguarding a nation?
So I'm going to tell you the inconvenient truth, because I think we're so afraid of saying anything to offend anyone, or anything that will make someone feel badly or make women or men feel guilty. And I certainly understand the sensitivity around that. But the inconvenient truth is that children don't care about your economic situation, and they don't care about your work ambitions, and they don't care about your personal goals. What they have irreducible emotional, physical, and neurological needs, and these are evolutionary needs. We've had these for millennium, and so, the idea that the things that I tell people, which are truths, is that children between the ages of 0 and 3 are neurologically fragile. They're not born resilient. They're born incredibly fragile. And they need the physical and emotional presence of a primary attachment figure as much as possible in those first 3 years. And that goes against the grain of modern society. It goes against the grain of feminism. It goes against the grain of the Me movement, from the 60s and 70s, and just the idea that if we want our children to be healthy, then we have to meet their early needs. Now, in the first 3 years, children are developing a sense of safety and security and trust, but they're also learning things like emotional regulation and resilience to stress. So there's so much research, and it's in my book if you want to read more of the research, but the research basically is very clear that children who do not have attachment security in the first 3 years, because they're prematurely, precociously separated from their primary attachment figure, who's usually their mother, do less well in terms of their resilience to stress in the future, and are more prone to having mental disorders in the future.
And the title of your book?
Being There: Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters.
So we talked about this before, but I'd love for you to just share again. Why is it important to invest in those first 1 to 3 years in a society like Israel more than other places? This is something that you said to me earlier.
Yeah, well, the more stress that a child is going to face, or an adult in the future is going to face in their life, the more important it is to reassure their early attachment security. So by the age of 3, 85% of the right brain is developed, and that's the part of the brain that helps you to deal with stress and cope with adversity in the future. It's also the part of the brain that helps you to regulate emotions. And so, but the ability to cope with and be resilient to stress in the future, in society, we're not asking the right questions. We should be asking, when does the development of that part of the brain happen, and how can we reinforce that part of the brain so whatever adversity is to come, that child can deal with it. And in Israel, even more than other parts of the world, adversity and stress is a major part of life here. So you want to do everything. And the truth is, as parents, we can't always protect our children from stress. We know we can't. And in Israel, you send children to war. And so, you can't always protect them. But what you can do is make sure that you've been there physically and emotionally as much as possible in the first 3 years. And that their emotional security is sound as they go into childhood and adulthood.
I'd like to ask you about your meetings this week. Who did you meet with this week, and what were the topics of conversation?
Well, I was primarily here this week with the Jerusalem Foundation Board. My husband's on the Jerusalem Foundation Board in America. So we were visiting social entrepreneurship projects around Jerusalem, which was really interesting to me. But as a result, I had wonderful conversations, because primarily I'm a clinician, and I was able to have very human conversations with people about the fear that their children feel, their very young children, and also the fear they feel as parents when their children go into the army. And so, what pervasively, I would say, not only was I able to have conversations about the trauma here, but just, the kind of the feeling of fear that people are a little hesitant to talk about, because it's counterculture in Israel. And yet maybe because I'm not Israeli, maybe because I'm a clinician, a therapist, maybe because I pry a little, it's my nature. And so I would say the most interesting part were the private conversations that I've been having. I also have meetings set up with members of the Knesset that are interested in hearing what I have to say about attachment security and the importance of how you can mitigate trauma with their young children. From what I understand, the Ethiopian community, which very much instinctually followed attachment security and skin-to-skin contact for, as part of their culture in moving to Israel, then was, forced to participate in the work culture, the outside home work culture to survive. And so their children were put into daycare like the rest of Israeli families do. And so I think it was shocking to them, and I think shocking to the children. And there was a trauma in and of itself in that, sort of the difference in the culture.
So did you meet with Panina or
No,
not yet?
Sunday, yeah.
Okay. I think that the biggest issue for women in Israel is the need to bring an income to the family. How do you recommend that women who want to stay home with their children but also need to put forward at least half of the funds for the home do so?
Again, I think there are ways for women to make a living without having to leave their children. They do it in other countries. Being in service fields or fields where you can work from home, or where you can work part-time or have more control and flexibility around your work is far better for being a mother, and it's far better for children than if you leave the home and work 9 hours in a job outside the home. You'd say life is long, and if we all live to the age of Moses, then we'll have plenty of time to work 8 and 9 hour days. But when you have very young children, that's not the time to do it if you have any other possibility or choice. One thing I say to young couples is to strategize before you have children and talk about these issues before you have children. Don't wait until you have children to talk about this, because by then you've made promises to one another, you've made financial commitments maybe you wouldn't have made otherwise. And talk about the sacrifice involved in one of you being present for that child in the early years as much as possible. Talk about ways to avoid daycare by having a relative or extended family member care for your child, rather than putting your child into a more anonymous feeling daycare with caregivers who are not kinship bonds. So there are ways of managing it, even if you have to work. I mean, one thing is for women to also think about the kind of work that they want to do before they choose the kind of work they want to do. Again, we encourage this work first, career first, education first ethos in modern society, instead of talking about relationships first and work second. And that's really what we should be teaching our children, that of course your purposeful and meaningful work is important, but not nearly as important as your family relationships. And we don't teach that to our children.
I've written down some of the takeaways from our conversation already, and at the Israel Daily News, I do a lot of top 5. Okay, so right now I have 6. I have 6 things written down from what you suggested for dealing and mitigating with trauma that exists right now throughout our society. And I'd love for us to have a recap of that, because I think that a lot of the listeners of the Israel Daily News, wherever they are, there's some level of trauma. Because within the last year and a half that my listeners and viewers have been with me, I am going through the news, and it's very traumatic. And it can be traumatic second or third hand, even if you haven't seen the footage like I've seen, and you're just hearing it. I'd like for you to share with us some things that you think are healthy for every person to be doing throughout this struggle right now?
Well, there's some really concrete things. One is lots of physical contact with the people you love. There was also this craze in America to buy pets, and there was a reason for it, which is that particularly with people who are single, but everyone needed contact. They needed, during COVID and to have contact. And so the idea is whenever there's adversity, whenever there's stress, have as much contact with the people you love, sleep with your children again, cuddle with your pets, hug your friends. Oxytocin is a 10-second hug, not a quick hug, but a 10-second, what I call a real hug. Have real hugs every day. Leave space in your life to check in with the people that you care about in terms of how they're feeling. Don't assume that they're okay just because they seem okay. Open up the conversation to how are you feeling today, and leave space for it to be I'm not okay today, or I'm having a bad day, or I'm having a good day. But not every day is the same, whether you're going through trauma or tragedy or not. But certainly in a time of great stress, you want to check in with the people you love. And leave space for expression of all feelings, non-judgmental space for all feelings.
Erica, I have thought since I've been in Israel that working women in Israel are amazing, and that there's a lot more space in this society versus the United States, where I grew up, for family, and that there's a lot more work-life balance. Can you speak to us about your findings from this week while you've been in Israel?
I mean, I think that there's a culture in Israel of embracing family and friends, and that people definitely make more time here for endeavors other than just their work alone. And I think where there could be improvement, again, and is why I run around the world educating women about the fact that that even in a society that's more enlightened like Israel, there's still quite a bit of emphasis on the economics and the importance of work. And I think, again, from 0 to 3, I would still like to see some improvement here in terms of people not, if they can help it, not using the daycare system.
Yes, using that daycare system. It was even shocking to me because in the U.S., I think most families put their kids into preschool at age 3. But here, kids are already going to the GAN by 1 year old.
Right. And that's not school. So, and when people call it school, I think it's a way to justify childcare and to justify more women in the workforce. And again, if we all are going to live till 120, like Moses, then the idea is that we have a long time to work those long days. But the time to work very short days or to not work at all is when your children are very young. It's a very small window to make a great impact on their personality for the rest of their lives. And it's a small sacrifice to make for a child's long-term mental health.
And that child is going to live a full life. So
Yes.
So it's important to think about. That was a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for being with us at the Israel Daily News.
Thank you for having me.